All right, welcome to Tuesday, February 28th, our third session for the night, third and final session for the night. Yours truly is going to be doing it with Caitlin White, a doc student and former middle school teacher and high school. You did high school 1 year, I think, right? And but primarily middle school. And so the title is called "The Great Fear of the Period: A Lesson on the Chinese Exclusion Act." And I'll let Caitlin introduce herself a bit more too.
Yes. Hi, my name is Caitlin White. As Dr. Kenneth said, I am a former middle school social studies teacher. Did that for several years and previously taught high school as well. I'm currently a PhD student and a graduate teaching assistant at the University of Tennessee. So that's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously I work at the University of Tennessee, taught in Florida for several years before coming here, and I spent a year in Texas as well at Texas Tech. But now I'm here. I'm also with the Tennessee Council for Social Studies, so you probably see me email you or something like that at one point or a time. Another. All right, so we've got a few objectives, and Caitlin's going to begin with the first one.
Yes. So our first objective is we want to share a lesson on the Chinese Exclusion Act that specifically integrates a variety of different primary sources.
And on top of that, of course, I mean, some of the things, even with Don's session before us, you're going to see maybe some similar techniques. The actual sources we'll use will be a bit different, but we also want to try to advocate for cooperative learning structures. And again, that's something Don even talked about using. And so certainly we're still wanting to advocate for them. And we want to do it not only for engagement purposes, but also as kind of a way to actually kind of enhance the rigor to some degree. Certainly it takes practice in the long run, but we think it's well worth it.
Yes. And finally, we would like to discuss how we even developed the lesson in the first place, what kind of inspired this particular presentation. So to begin, let's dive into that. Let's talk about it. So this past summer 2022, Dr. Kenna and I attended a workshop in Minneapolis that was facilitated by TPS, better known as Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium. And they also worked in conjunction with the Library of Congress. And essentially, they were trying to encourage us to, and not just encourage us, but teach us how to find primary sources using the Library of Congress archives. They talked with us about how many different artifacts and different sources they get in each and every day, bags, trash cans full, and how they then go about archiving them. And so it's like, when you have so much supply, how do teachers like you and I even go about finding what sources we could potentially implement into a lesson? So they taught us how to navigate that. Once they kind of talked us through that, and we'll also address that somewhat here as well, they had us look for a specific primary source to build a lesson off of. And so once we found that primary source, then using an inquiry-based kind of framework or strategy to complete or design an entire lesson. So that's what you're going to see today, is kind of what we developed based on the tools they gave us. So with that in mind, once we had a primary source, which again, I will show you guys here shortly, we found what standard went with it. And so the primary source we ended up selecting really worked well with this particular one. And the parts of the primary source, or excuse me, the parts of the standard, I should say, that we're going to address is to describe the differences between old and new immigrants, analyze the assimilation process for new immigrants. Now, the last half of the standard is not necessarily something this lesson in particular addresses. However, it very much could be an extension activity that you might want to do with your students so that it's relevant and they can make connections to today. But again, this is what this particular lesson will cover. Now, looking down at the bullet points, you could definitely make a lot of connections with the things we're talking about regarding Angel Island, where many Chinese immigrants came through the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1890s. Ellis Island, which is also another point of immigrants coming in, new immigrants in particular. Push and pull factors, what's drawing people to the United States, what's pushing them away also from maybe their home countries. Ethnic clusters as well, the neighborhoods that they might start, or they might not, they actually do start creating, such as like Chinatowns, in particular in regards to this lesson. Competition for jobs, that was definitely a pull factor for a lot of immigrants, in particular Chinese immigrants, definitely being drawn to labor opportunities with the Transcontinental Railroad, for instance. The rise of nativism as a result of this competition for jobs. Again, nativism is not necessarily you are someone who is a Native American, but it's someone who recognizes that they are a part of the founding of this country and they feel like others coming in are diluting that. So that's all in response to, again, all these people coming in, the rise for, or the competition for jobs. And again, what we're primarily focusing on, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it can also even mention the gentleman's agreement as well. So again, this covers so much, as you see. So let's kind of break that down even further. But before we do that, Dr. Ken is going to talk to you about
and one thing
practices.
we also, a lot of teachers, these officially were adopted in fall of 2019. We all know what happened with that academic year, the back half of it. But these are the social studies practice standards, standard 1, 2, and 3. And we're going to be collecting information from a variety of primary, secondary sources, critically examining, particularly the two kind of sub-bullet points or several sub-bullet points underneath these. And then with the third one, we're really going to be synthesizing, kind of establishing accuracy or validity, really comparing sources to each other. We could even talk about historical awareness, geographic awareness, which is social studies practice, 5 and 6 respectively. Even the fourth one, which is if you choose to do a writing component or communication component, we can be doing that. So this lesson, it's an inquiry-based lesson. You're going to be hitting, these practice standards as well as obviously a content standard. So you're really hitting all of these simultaneously, at least small chunks of it, on a continuous basis.
Yes. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about the hook. So the hook, again, is starting with a primary source. And the Library of Congress has a great, primary analysis tool that you can use. There is a direct link if you would like to kind of explore what other tools that they have. But the one we're going to be using is, as it says, the primary source analysis tool. Now, it's really important that when you're looking at this, because when you directly look at it, it very much comes across as linear. Like first you observe the primary source, then you reflect on it, then you ask questions. But if you look up here in the corner, what they're hoping students will do and what we want to encourage our students to do is think of this as a cyclical practice. So constantly coming and circling back around to different things. So they observe and then they reflect and then they question. And then once they do that themselves, talking with a shoulder partner about it, having this be like a think, pair, share. And once they discuss it with a shoulder partner, for instance, they might then say, wow, I didn't make that observation. So I'm going to circle back around to that. Or, whoa, that's an interesting question. Or that's an interesting reflection there. What kind of questions might we have about that? So again, this is a great, very easy, simple tool to use that can really help generate questions. That's something that we want our students to do. Now, if your students do happen to struggle generating questions, you could, of course, provide question stems. That could be very helpful for students too, right? Adding those scaffolds, those supports in there for them. Okay. Oh, I was just making sure some people put some stuff up. The higher grade. Oh, okay. I was just making sure I wasn't missing somebody. Okay.
I'm just putting
So that is how we're going to start that. So yes, whoa, what a transition there, right?
Yeah.
But this is the hook, right?
Right.
The
yeah.
hook
So
is. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this is the hook, right? That we found. This is really when they prompted us at the workshop to kind of find something, we came across this, and I think we instantly both knew, like, oh, this is what we could build a lesson around this. Like, so this was the lesson, and we decided, this is what we were going to do. This particular technique, similar to what Dawn did in the previous session, those of you who attended, where she kind of blocked off things. So we're going to be using that blocking off section. So if you could use the chat feature, I know Not everyone wants to necessarily want to turn on the camera or microphone or anything like that, but use the chat feature. We'll use the Library of Congress tool, kind of briefly talk about an observation, maybe a reflection, and maybe a question you might have of what is happening. So if we can maybe get 2, 3 observations, maybe 2, 3 questions that you put in the chat box. All right, here they come. It just takes a while. They got to actually observe. We got to give them that proper wait time, right? Characters
Yeah.
are standing on what looks like a map. This suggests that this is bridging a wide area. Who is being eaten? All right. That was a good question. Who is being eaten? And it does look like a map. Maybe someone else, one more. And if it's easier not to type, just to say something. The Great Fear. The fact that the phrase "the Great Fear," we love that title too. The Great Fear. Obviously, we use it in our title for our session. Yeah, so we see the words "the great fear of the period," that Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners. So then we might ask, who do we think that middle person is? And it would probably be Uncle Sam. Not only the phrase here, but also just some of the iconic um, images. I know it's not really in black or color too much, but we have those kind of pinstripe pants with the coattails, kind of famous for Uncle Sam. And we have the two people eating Uncle Sam, right? You can also point that out. We've got uh, someone over here on the left. Maybe we might think it's anyone. Maybe guess the ethnic foreigner that it might be.
There we go.
Yeah, we go. We got the Irish, right? And then on the left, might be giving it away, the Chinese. Now, the map is something to point out, and it's hard to see. It's right over here. It says Pacific. Can you see my mouse? Can you guys see
No.
my mouse? No, dang it. Here I'm like right over here, right over here. Yeah, on the far right behind the Chinese gentleman is a mouse, or is my mouse, is the word Pacific. And shortly behind the Irish person is the word Atlantic. I think I actually cut some of it off. I took a screenshot of this. And so this is actually like you're standing in Canada. Imagine you're standing in Canada looking south towards the South Pole. And so this little bit in the middle there's like a Mississippi River running through there, probably the Missouri, the Ohio, maybe somewhere in there as well. You got a little bit of Florida, you can see Texas. And then you see little trains, little choo-choo trains, right? So this is all over the United States, from Pacific to Atlantic. And all right, I won't sing it. All the Christmas song coming into my head now. All right. Yeah, and the haircut. That's right. So we've got now one other thing you might notice, there's a number 1 right above Uncle Sam. All right, so we'll hit the next button. And so we'll see number 2. So we're in the same area roughly. We've got a few other observations you might notice. Uncle Sam's still being eaten. We still got the same characters, but the only one who seems to be eating the most is one particular group, and it's not really the Irish coming in with over the head. Well, they might say, "Oh, well, it's hard to get over the shoulders, just like a snake, right?" But that might be taking it a little too literal. So we finally get to the final one, the third piece, and we see the Chinese have not only eaten Uncle Sam, they are now starting to eat the Irish. And if we zoom out to the full one, we see all 3 pieces kind of work together. And what's interesting is we see at the beginning, the great fear of the period, that Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners. And then at the bottom, it says problem solved. Now, for Uncle Sam, I don't know if that solved the problem that the Chinese immigrants not only ate him, but also ate the other foreigner trying to eat him. Meaning the only thing you can maybe what do we think is coming? What's the author or the authors trying to depict in this particular message? All right, transcontinental railroad labor, certainly, yes. That's why you see the trains going across. And these are two key figures. I'm sure there were other figures that were part of the transcontinental, but we all know, as maybe as social studies people, you might know that these are two big figures for that, and that the Chinese were going to maybe win the transcontinental railroad race, perhaps, from the Pacific side, which I don't know if that was the case, actually, right? Yeah, so Chinese figure has the hat, right? So he's taking over and kind of taking on the syncretism. And so I think, who was it? What was our next point? Was that you? Yeah.
Yes. So again, as Dr. Kenna mentioned, we utilize what's called a blocking out strategy. It's somewhat similar to the concept of zoom in, zoom out, but it's where when you have a lot going on, in particular in a political cartoon, how you can zoom in or you can block out specific parts so that students just specifically focus on that and then piece together the narrative. Now, although the political cartoon I have included here is not related to our lesson, it was just using it as an example, this is definitely one that has a lot going on. It's even more so than the one we showed. So again, this is a great strategy to use when you're trying to have students make sense of what's happening here. Because if you just put this up on a board and said, here's a primary analysis tool, go tell me what you observe, they will struggle to know where to look and might miss things. So it is really good to do this. It's very applicable to all kinds of different primary sources that you might have seen before, and that's why we've chosen to use it in this lesson.
Right. So going back to that hook activity, we always want to come back to source and contextualization. So this particular piece is called and I'll put a link to it as well so you can find it. And we'll put a link on our website or the TCSS website for this entire presentation so you can then access, the links inside of it. But it's called The Fear of the Period That Uncle Sam May Be Swallowed. It was published between 1860, 1869 from a San Francisco publisher, White and Bauer, and kind of a lithograph there. And you can see the summary. I think we get the idea of what's happening here. And go on to the next thing. And so this would lead us to our compelling question, right?
Yes, so we came up with a compelling question. Oftentimes you might hear the phrase essential question. And when I look at it, an essential question, a lot of my interns' lessons, it's usually related specifically to that lesson. So in this case, they might ask a question related to the Chinese Exclusion Act. But in our question, a compelling question is how can we make it relevant to students' lives? So it's a little more broad, and it's something that you could continuously thread throughout this lesson, but then the subsequent lessons as well, if you look back at that standard, because you're not just addressing the Chinese Exclusion Act, you also address new immigrants and old immigrants in the gentleman's agreement. So this would be a great way to kind of start that conversation and ask, hey, is immigration a major discussion point today? And more than likely, some students will be like, yeah, they might even have an interesting comment or two. So taking in all those comments and saying, okay, let's kind of understand the historical context behind it all and trace it. And the Chinese Exclusion Act can be a great way to do that.
Right. So in providing a little bit of historical background, we actually are utilizing a primary source. Now, this particular source, again, has a lot going on to the point where you can't really even read a lot of it. I will say when you look at the Library of Congress website, they use a really high res camera to digitize these documents. And so you can zoom in very well on the Library of Congress website. I just happened to take a screenshot of it to put it in the PowerPoint. So one thing that does draw your attention to is a map of census data related to foreign population from the census of 1880. I think the map itself was made, I think, in 81. So we're going to zoom into this portion here, just so you know where we're going. And even then, it's still a little bit blurry. And we'll highlight a few pieces in here that we want students to probably notice. The first group has made up of 4 subgroups. It's all Great Britain and Ireland. And of those 4 subgroups, Irish, English, Scottish, and Wales, we see that the Irish are the #1 primary population in 1880 census. Then we have a large German population. In fact, the Irish are almost as much as the entire German population. Then we move on to there's British Americans, so Canadians, Nova Scotians, New Brunswick, which is today all part of Canada, but at the time they were separate. And then finally, we see the Chinese down here as the seventh largest group. It's hard to tell, like 200, a little over 200,000 people compared to, the Irish is 1.2 million, 1.3 million, something like that. I mean, they're behind Swedish and Norway and French. Can you go back for a second?
Oh, sorry.
And even if you look at this, all of the groups on this are European with the exception of Chinese and Mexico. All right, so those are the only non-European based countries on the 1880 census. It doesn't mean we didn't have any. There is other, of course, number 20 on there, but nothing that was very large to put on the map. All right, and so we'll look at another element of this particular map. Now, my art teacher growing up told me to, when doing shade and stuff, said to kind of look at something and blur your eyes, and then that way you can see where lights are. If you look at the larger image, hold on, back up. If you look at the larger image, you kind of blur your eyes. You kind of see where does most of the foreign population in the 1880 census tend to move. And you might think, oh, that's like north by the Great Lakes area, what we now know is the kind of it was the Northwest Territories at that kind of time period. But now it's the the Midwest, and then even the northern cities. We definitely could see it there in New York. Why might that be? We asked the students. Ellis Island, of course. We also see California gets a heavy population, and of course, there's a big port there. What might that be? Angel Island. But even look in the southeast where we are here in Tennessee, not too many. I think we can see Knox County. I think we're up there somewhere where I'm at. You can maybe find your county. It's kind of hard to tell, but you could probably even find Charleston, South Carolina. You could see the Jacksonville area. You could definitely see, well, the red line is blocking New Orleans, but you can see these ports of entries where people come from or come into. And so while we talk about Angel Island and Ellis Island, there are other ports that people got in. And you definitely see land transitions too, down in Texas with Mexico, Canada. You can see it up in tip of Maine and right along the Minnesota border, all that kind of stuff. So really teaching students this. But what's interesting about this map is when you blur your eyes with the large one, you almost see nothing in the middle. You can go over what we call the flyover states now. But if we zoom into that smaller map, which kind of accumulates and says, here's what the percentage of foreign-born population is, and you blur your eyes, you would think, where's everyone moving to? And it almost looks exclusive, like, man, look at Nevada. Everyone's moving to Nevada, California, Utah, Idaho, all those western states. But yet we go back to that map again, the larger map, and like it's like no one is in Utah, like no one is in Idaho or Mexico, and it's all because they're in small isolated towns or counties, which is why that kind of skews the data. So that's another aspect that we can teach about understanding, particularly geographic representation in data. So kind of a geographic awareness, those of you who are geography people out there. All right, we move on to the next thing. There's one more point I want to talk about with this one, and it was right at the very top of this map. It actually gave you what they call a retrospect. It gave you, it's a little blurry, but 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880 percentage of the population that came that was foreign born during that particular census. And so we see the largest percentage was actually the census just before this in 1870. I was like a little over 14%. And now, despite the census being in 1870, the data was actually really kind of capturing people that came from like 1861 to 1869, right? So it's kind of surprising. I thought, Caitlin and I both thought it was a little surprising to see, we had a major war going on in the United States at that time, and yet such a large portion of people were moving into the country. Although perhaps it was the last half of that century or that decade, I mean, why we needed so many foreign-born immigrants to come into the country, because we lost a lot of American lives. So just kind of an interesting note. So we'll move on. Oh, yes. The Irish need not apply. I'll let Caitlin take this one, I think.
Okay, so this was interesting because when Dr. Ken and I were discussing this lesson and developing it, and specifically looking back at that primary source of the eventually the Chinese eating the Irish, and that kind of competition for jobs there, we brought up the thought of no Irish need apply when it comes to jobs. And I told him how when I taught about this, I actually used a song, and you can look it up on YouTube, and it's got a great Irish accent, and it's almost like a drinking song that they might have sang in taverns at that time. But it was all about the fact that it was hard to get jobs, and how they were proud to be Irish. But when Dr. Kenna went and looked up a little bit more about it, he also found this particular source that if you break down the lyrics, and he has some of them highlighted here, um, these these are somewhat lyrics from a different time. So this actually tells you a little bit of how or why the Irish might have left Ireland, right? It's so much more than a potato famine for one group. These are like the newer Irish potentially. And it was because of their sister country, aka England, ruling them. So they were looking forward to coming to this glorious land of America, referencing even the Union. So thinking of the time period there with the Civil War, needing fresh bodies to go out there and fight for liberty. So this kind of alludes to that pull factor. But then later on, that competition for jobs happens, and you could even show how, through the lyrics of the song I was mentioning that was written later, how then they felt the same exact way.
Yeah, we
So
talked.
it has a little
Sorry to
bit more on
interrupt.
that. No,
Yeah, we
you're
talked
fine.
with this. Can you go back one more? Yeah, with this was actually written in 1862, and so when she talks
Mhm.
about the author Kathleen O'Neill, it was published in Philadelphia. She's saying they being the British rule over us, to their sister country being Ireland, but yet she's looking forward to coming here. And I kind of wondered if this was a propaganda um, poster,
Yes.
like paid to write it to encourage Irish to come to America, because we've had Irish come for many years, and particularly Union forces might need more immigrants coming in. Particularly, most of the ports were northern ports: Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and so we needed them coming in, not only just to fight in the war, but for other ventures within, to run a country and to win a war. Obviously, like she said, we'll look at, and there was a study published in 2002 by a history professor named Jernigan or something like that, and he kind of estimates that the Irish need not apply aspect is kind of a myth, that he couldn't find much data. I think he said he scoured 6 decades worth of historical newspapers and found maybe 2 references a decade. However, oddly enough, a 14-year-old girl kind of challenged that, and a year later, when she was 15, she published a paper, and she said she found about 9 instances a year in various newspapers, all on the Library of Congress. Not to mention those that are outside of the Library of Congress's kind of domain for or copyright and what they have in their archives. So she kind of challenged it, as well as, and we'll move to this next piece. This is the next one. There are similar sentiments. So here's an ad, for example, from, I believe it's May 1st of 1855 New York Times. And so how often, it's a little hard to see, and we'll help you here in a second, but how often do you see the phrase "no Irish need apply"? We'll tell you it's one time. So yeah, you can see only one instance, but what other words might come across with that same sentiment? And we see here, it's all 5 other ads use the word Protestant. A Protestant is who they're looking for. So they don't necessarily say that Irish can apply. They're just saying Protestants should only apply. And of course, we might know, maybe our students don't know, but you might want to tell them a lot of Irish, for the most part, are Catholics. Now, this isn't to say that every Irish is Catholic, as there is a Northern Ireland, and that's a whole nother thing to get into. But most Irish were Catholic. And of course, we can also speak to what other Catholic groups might have been being discriminated against as a result of it, and throwing the Italians and some of the others. So this does start to bring out that standard about comparing new and old immigrants. We start to see a shift and kind of where they're coming from in Europe, and also, of course, the religion that they're bringing in as well. And so all of this to say, when we talk about the Irish, is the Irish were kind of looked down upon for a decent amount as kind of a low. They were willing to break union lines and things of that nature as well. And so a lot of people didn't necessarily like them. And yet here we see the Chinese coming in, and they were seen as something potentially worse, at least according to that, the authors or authors of that initial hook activity that we showed you, that they potentially can come in and not only eat Uncle Sam, but take over and eat the Irish. Okay. So it's kind of an interesting thing to be projecting in 1860, 1869. I think we got one more source to show you.
Yes, so this is another source we also found through the Library of Congress. And just like with the others, using that blocking strategy would be very beneficial here, potentially showing this kind of foreground area first, noticing Uncle Sam here using congressional mortar and having immigrants as well as freedmen help build a wall. And the wall has all of these things attached to it, like law against race or jealousy. And this wall is being built. But if you look in the background, what's happening is the Chinese are basically tearing down the Great Wall of China and opening it up to Americans, that open door policy that eventually happens. And what's occurring here as well, and it's kind of hard to see, and that's why this blocking strategy is very helpful, is that across all these little things in the background, as well as what's coming here on like a crane, it actually says T. So it's suggesting about mercantilism and American imperialism, essentially. And so by having students kind of understand and make sense of what's going on here, we're building up a wall as they're tearing one down for us as the United States. And so we think this would be really good to use with that primary analysis tool as well.
And this maybe also brings in the rise of nativism, even for former immigrants, such as the Irish, who are helping build the wall. Like they and other immigrants across the line, and poor white Southerners, the kind of the one with the jealousy block. We presume to be that, to be fair. I don't know for sure. So they're building this wall. And as they've been here now, they maybe been here 10, 15, 20 years or longer. And they were immigrants too, but now they don't want any more immigrants to come, particularly Chinese. And so they're helping build the wall. It's like, it's okay for immigrants to come, but no more after me type of a deal, which is true for a lot of things in life. We say sometimes, it's okay for me to chew gum, but not you. Anyways.
Yeah.
And so one of our another point we had was to talk about cooperative structure. So we didn't really talk too much, but in that hook activity, we would often do the traditional think, pair, shares with the observe, reflect, and question kind of Library of Congress document analysis, where they share with their partners some of the things that they're finding, and then kind of we can bring them into a larger group to share. But we'd also do the similarity grouping, and this is where we start getting to that SSP3, where we start to compare the sources and talk about how they agree or disagree. And so one thing with similarity grouping, if you've not heard of this particular cooperative structure, it can work in a lot of different ways. You can use that as a hook too, where you give students a document and you just tell them to group themselves based on something that they find similar in the document. It could be a word base, it could be a visual. Heck, you don't even have to. I've done this with students, and I say, what did you eat for lunch, or what did you eat for breakfast? And then I tell them to get up and form groups of 3 based on some kind of similarity. And students will say, oh, we all had meat, or some say, oh, we all had nothing, or we had Pop-Tarts, or we had sugary things, or we had sports drinks. And that's a way to form random groups, and students get to know each other. They build teamwork, they build camaraderie, but you can also do it with content. So we can do it then with some of these sources. We can hand out a few of these sources, particularly if you can print them. I know that's sometimes a hard task to do, especially if they need to have color in them. But if you can print some of these off, they don't have to be in full length. And then you can ask students to kind of take a moment to look at it, maybe write down 1 to 2 to 3 main kind of things that you think they're coming across. And then once they have those things written, kind of form groups with someone else who doesn't have the same source as you, because obviously that would be a little too easy, and find how they're similar, and potentially, eventually once they form, you ask them to kind of share out as a kind of a large group share. And you can also do kind of anti-similarity, so to speak, only because of this particular thing. Like, what are some disagreements that they might have, and can we come up with similar disagreements, and you can maybe create pairs. And so we'll slip to the next slide, because we'll put the three main things together. And of course, you could repeat this multiple times just to kind of hit it home for students that there is multiple things that they're similar or disagreeing with each other. So how are these sources agreeing or disagreeing on the topic of Chinese immigration? So if you remember the Hook one, the census data one, or the 1882 political cartoon, and then we put the dates, and SF as San Francisco and NY as New York, kind of where it was published, kind of that sourcing information. And which is kind of interesting. If anyone willing to share, type in what you think, what's the competing elements, like how do they disagree or agree with the Chinese immigration? Nope, I got one more primary source to put in the document or in the chat box. Yeah, there are blatant racial stereotypes in the first and third. So those are things that you can agree. And then the middle one might seem odd. Like people might, well, there's not really much to be said about Chinese immigrants in that middle one. But we do remember they were listed down there at the bottom. We see Chinese immigrants moving east over time. That's true. And then you might see the reverse, all the other ones moving west over time, from the Ellis Island, of course. We also, let's see, even the second classifies based on regions, which suggests the need to keep track of racial elements. All right. Middle is contradictory to others in a way. Thank you, Karen. We're hoping someone will get that. So the middle seems to be contradictory.
Yeah.
It actually said the Irish were still in 1880, a decade later, the 1880, the Chinese were not the main, they weren't the problem solver as the first author or illustrator would have suggested. I'm not sure exactly what problem. I'm still confused on how the Chinese eating Uncle Sam and the Irish solved the problem per se, but it's still nonetheless intriguing to look at, and just makes me ponder. But yeah, the Chinese never did. Now we might say, well, that's because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, or we took policies in place, but we know that those didn't happen until 1882. So it's still kind of odd to see that it never really came to fruition. There's various other reasons, and we don't necessarily have to go into all of them, but you want students to start thinking about that. At this point, you could give away kind of a traditional expository text, i.e. the textbook or something like that. Yes, go ahead, Reed.
Well, that first one, part from what I understand is that the very last thing, if you notice, the Chinese guy is eating the other guy, but also if you look at the Chinese guy, he's assimilated. Basically, he's all in one. It's now we solve a problem. It's all just now one problem under one giant umbrella, and so there's a whole lot of concept there that it's no longer a double problem. It's now one problem and it's being solved totally.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. So Karen, there was less pushback from the Chinese than the Irish. Yeah, I think the Chinese were a bit less vocal than the Irish were. We definitely, part of that had to do with probably the sheer numbers of Irish that came in, and the historical oppression that they experienced underneath the British. To be fair, I think, and obviously we had a lot of British immigrants continuing to coming into this country. We were founded often from British colonies, so there's a lot of things that went into that. I assume that we don't necessarily hear, and then this is where we can start talking about ethnic clusters a little bit, because obviously we start seeing cities form or groups form into little clusters, including Chinatowns, which is kind of us telling Caitlin loves to kind of talk every time we talks about this. She's like, oh, we should talk about the Chinatowns, and how they formulated their Chinatowns apparently there's like a kind of like a playbook, so to speak, on how they should form Chinatowns across the world. Almost to be an amusement
You can go to
attraction.
a Chinatown in London. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I was just
Yeah, go
gonna
ahead.
say you could go to a Chinatown in London and it's the exact, it's like a carbon copy, and it was a way to preserve um their ethnicity and preserve themselves so that they can thrive. So even if you look around in Chinatowns today, they don't actually necessarily mirror the true architecture of what China was. It was more so for tourism. And so, yeah, there's so much about that if you're interested, I encourage you to look up more about, because it really completes and creates a very interesting narrative for your students regarding ethnic clusters.
All right. And then this is where you could maybe obviously ask students to answer the question or to do some kind of
Mhm.
paragraph, or just a little writing or big writing, depending on what you're comfortable with and what you feel like your students are capable and also where this fits in the year. I'm always big on you don't just drop an essay anywhere, but you being mindful of what you're doing. So last I think we got is just kind of talking about where we found these sources. I know I put the sources in the chat box, and they're in the PowerPoint, but we specifically utilize a little search hack that they told us about, which made it so much faster. Because years ago, I remember learning the primary source used to say, or Library of Congress used to say, we have 2 million digitized documents, which is like a bragging right. Like, man, we've got something for you. The problem is, have you ever tried to look for 2 million digitized documents? And now, most recently, they say they don't even measure how many documents anymore. They say they measure like terabytes worth of data. We have terabytes worth of data, which can't even fathom how many digitized documents, let alone non-digitized documents they have. So one hack was to utilize Google to help search the Library of Congress. And so the search was you type in a topic, and then you use the word cite colon Library of Congress LOC.gov. So we would do the Chinese Exclusion Act site LOC.gov, and you can choose to look at just images or just look at web stuff, and then you would see Google would search nothing but Library of Congress to find things related to your topic. You can do it with baseball, and then you can do it with other sites. I think Don in the previous session mentioned the National Archives and Records Administration. You can do it with that website, particularly if a website has a lot of is a rather large website, like a lot of government websites. You can do it with pick another big website out there, and you can do that same technique to look for things. And it's just an advanced Google search, as Caitlin said there, wrote down there at the bottom. But obviously, you can also go straight to Library of Congress website. They've got pre-made sets, and they got teacher guides available as well. So there's a lot really out there. And I think last we'll talk about, make sure we hit on all of our standards again. I think we could describe a little bit. We didn't get over every old and new kind of difference, but we analyzed some of the assimilation process a bit as well. Again, we can go a little bit deeper with that. We would, of course, in the lesson. Angel Island, we talked Ellis Island, push and pull factors. We talked about ethnic clusters, competition, rise of nativism, Chinese exclusion. What we didn't really get to is gentleman's agreement, but we can then talk about them, particularly with we saw some of the populations in like Seattle and that kind of stuff, getting into a lot of the groups. And we had actually a primary source we wanted to show for that, but we decided not to. There's too much.
Yes.
There were fears apparently in Seattle that the Chinese or the Japanese, and I think it was 1919. They said there was going to be more Japanese owned businesses in Seattle than any other ethnic group. So it was kind of interesting. All right. I think that's it. Do we have any questions, concerns, compliments, wonders? No, we just did such a fantastic job. I appreciate it.
Oh, cool. Okay.
No, no problems, Aaron. Again, we just hope you can use it. If you want to come back to the same place you went to get this session, to log into the session, we'll put this whole PowerPoint in there. Again, don't forget. So it's topic, then it's the word cite, and then it's the website that you want. And that's the little hack. So it's the topic you're looking for, then the word site, colon, and then whatever the website is without the www. And so for Library of Congress, just loc.gov. All right. And if you ever have questions, you can email us there. Of course, I'm also part of the Tennessee Council for Social Studies, again, as most of you probably know. So feel free to reach out. And if you're going to be in Franklin on Friday, I look forward to seeing you. If not, don't forget, we have the National Council for Social Studies coming to Nashville in December of 2023. So technically it's this year, but next academic year. As a result, the Tennessee Council will not be having a spring conference. As we might maybe do a virtual, kind of a free virtual thing, just so people don't forget about us, but we won't do an official one. The dates for that, Karen, it's like December 1st, 2nd, 3rd, something like that. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, NCSS. It's the 103rd Annual Conference, and it is Meet Us in Music City is the kind of the topic. Yeah, December 1st through the 3rd, which usually is a Friday through Sunday. Just so it must be December 1st, Friday. Sunday is the December 3rd. So, and if you've not been to an NCSS, which is the reason why we're not doing a TCSS, because they're a bit more expensive, but there's usually thousands of teachers, 4,000-5,000. We'll see. Nashville is a pretty central location, so it might be pretty popular. We're hoping. So it's going to be massive. And schools, you ask your principals to spend some money to send you there. Ask now, because one, you're in the state of Tennessee, so you can get there pretty easy. But also, schools usually are willing to spend more money for you to go to a national conference than a state conference. Yeah, ask early. All right. Well, I'll let you all have a great evening, and thanks for watching.